Your grandfather was David Rockefeller, of course, Chase Manhattan Bank. Or have you started there at J.P. Morgan Chase? And if so, what are you actually trying to accomplish and how have you been received?
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having us on this morning. Absolutely. J.P. Morgan Chase is the starting point, and for one very clear reason, which is that the bank is the largest financier of fossil fuels by far. Now, it's important to make a point that there's a difference between investing in fossil fuels and lending and underwriting to fossil fuels. And both sides of the house, so to speak, are important. In 2019, JP Morgan financed $65 billion to the fossil fuel industry. And what's so critical about that is that the money that goes in today that's lent to fossil fuel companies for the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure and the ongoing operations of these firms establishes a trajectory which will put us far above the 1.5-degree temperature increase that scientists have told us is critical to maintain in order to have a livable world and a healthy economy going forward into the future.
But they're not going to stop lending to fossil fuel companies, are they?
Well, that's the thing, is they have to in order to not bring about systemic shocks to our economy. So there's a strange thing happening right now where the business world is still trying to wrap its head around the idea of climate change, that there are true risks to the economy that aren't just about transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's actually, as we've seen this year in California, widespread wildfires, increasing intensity and frequency of hurricanes. And if you think about an issue like global migration, 5 million refugees from Syria and the Middle East in the last several years caused massive political disruption in the European Union and led in many ways to Brexit, people say. So if you extend that, looking at the broader picture of climate change unchecked, what happens when we get 50 or 100 million climate refugees? What will that do to the global economy? So there's a very direct economic connection, which if banks such as JP Morgan don't change their practices, ultimately it's very poor business over the longer term.
Valerie, without access to capital and access to financing from big institutions, many players in the industry would go bankrupt. Is that your ultimate goal here?
No, our ultimate goal is to save the environment and try to help as many people as possible. And obviously, as Rockefellers, we feel a special moral obligation to try to counteract the damage that has been done by fossil fuels. But we've known for decades how damaging these are. And also, frankly, in the last decade, fossil fuel companies have already been losing money despite $500 trillion in global subsidies. That is tax dollar money around the world that should be going into protecting our environment and our health, that's instead going into propping up these fossil fuel companies. Where the money should be going, where we should have our focus, and the focus of Bank Forward is to, of course, not only dry up capital to dirty energy, but to put it into clean energy. I'm from West Virginia. Coal has been declining there. It reached its peak in the 1950s. There were 150,000 coal jobs then. The year I was born, 1971, down to 64,000 jobs. Now there are about 14,000 jobs in coal. The future is in solar. You create 3 times more, or other renewables. You create more jobs when you go into renewables, and that's what we want our capital to be doing.
Danny, I want to get your thoughts as well on where the money should be going. JP Morgan committed $30 billion to advance racial equity last week. Do you think that it and other banks need to do something similar with regard to climate initiatives?
Absolutely. And at the same time, they have to pivot away from their lending and underwriting of the fossil fuel industry. To use an analogy, if a city's dealing with a flood, the issue of people moving to higher ground, which would be financing clean energy in this case, is less important than simply stopping the flow of new water into their homes. So think about Hurricane Katrina. You could say, let's move people out of their homes, but that doesn't work very well when the floodwaters are still coming in. So yes, people in the 5th Ward of New Orleans should have access to a safer environment to live in, but during Hurricane Katrina, they needed the water to stop. And that's the situation that we're in right now with fossil fuels. On top of that, as Jim Cramer has pointed out, how fossil fuels are really passing into the past. The financial returns of the fossil fuel industry, they're now at the bottom of the S&P 500 for the last 10 years. They've been lending out, they've been taking giant loans simply in order to pay dividends to their shareholders. So there's a need to both pivot away from fossil fuels and absolutely to finance the incredible opportunities that exist in transitioning our world to being safe on climate and having a more equitable and just system for all.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.